Welcome everybody to another episode of Roundtable Conversations, where we do our best to spread the roundtable spirit and technique of listening. We want to spread the art of listening in conversation, especially when discussing divisive topics. And today we have a wonderfully divisive topic, which is very current in today's United States. The topic at hand is, what does the Black community in the United States need in order to thrive? We have a wonderful panel of speakers today. We have David Greene, Ken Freeman, Erik Carter, and Omega Chambers, sorry. And I'm going to do a quick reminder of the roundtable rules, according to which we hold this roundtable. We have 5 rules. The first rule is all participants are equal in importance. The second rule is one speaker speaks at a time. The third rule is when we don't speak, we listen. This is very, very challenging in this day and age, but we are going to overcome and do our best. The fourth rule is we don't argue, we don't negate other speakers, we simply add to a common shared pool of meaning, whatever our values and concerns are. And the last point is we talk to the point. And without any further ado, I would like to give the stage to our wonderful participants. David Greene, why don't you get started? The first round will be an introduction. Why don't you take 2 minutes each to introduce yourself? David, take it away.
Thanks, Tomer. My name is David Greene. I live in Westchester, New York, town of Dobbs Ferry. I taught high school for 38 years in New York City and surrounding suburbs, Woodlands High School in Greenburgh and Scarsdale High School. So I've run the full gamut. As I was saying earlier to Omega, who's got the Golden Gate Bridge behind him, I was born in Los Angeles, was kidnapped by my parents and brought to New York as a young boy, raised in the Bronx, grew up in the Bronx, went to school in the Bronx, lived in very integrated neighborhoods for the most part, and ended up teaching right in my old neighborhood for a while. So that's a lot of the stuff that sort of framed who I am and how I think about the subject, because most of the guys that I played ball with or did stuff with in the schoolyard or elsewhere were not white. So for a long time, I was the white shadow in my neighborhood. So I think I can bring that to the discussion. I'm married, have 2 grown kids, and basically that's it.
Beautiful, 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 beautiful. Ken Freeman, go ahead, take it away.
Hi there, my name is Ken Freeman. Like Dave, I live in Westchester County, New York. Live a good bit north of Dave, out sort of in the country in a little town called Somers. My background, obviously I am white. So, that obviously limits somewhat my perspective. Having said that, though, as a small child, I spent some time living with grandparents who lived in the Roxbury section of Boston, where I noted that we were some of the few white people in the area. But I spent most of my years growing up in communities that were almost exclusively white. Interestingly, I largely grew up in a community on Long Island called East Meadow, surrounded by a number of predominantly Black communities, and yet our community was totally white and not super affluent or anything like that. I think it was just a question of segregation. In fact, really saw most things in a largely segregated way until my wife and I, in the early 1970s, moved out to the Midwest. We spent about 5 years living in Cincinnati. And we were somewhat surprised to find that living in a very pleasant middle-class to upper-middle-class suburban community, it was very much integrated. African-Americans made up 20-25% of the population. In more recent years, one item in my background that does provide, I think, some perspective is we have somewhat informally adopted a family of color. The mother is a woman who actually, as a child, grew up in really bad foster homes. My wife saw her in therapy, and she's the only person my wife has ever dealt with professionally that she continued to have a personal relationship with afterwards. We've largely brought her into our family. She is Puerto Rican in background, but she has two children that have African-American fathers. And so, I oftentimes get some funny looks from people when these two adorable African-American children call me grandpa. But they are family to us, and very much a part of our lives.
Thank you, Ken. And Erik.
Great. Well, thanks for having me. Should be an interesting conversation. So my background as it relates to this topic, I myself am multiracial. My father is a mix of Black, Irish, and Native American. My mom is an immigrant from the Philippines. So I had, growing up, that hearing stories from my father about, the racism he experienced, especially growing up, but also getting kind of the Asian immigrant experience from my mother. And then I grew up in a almost completely white, rural working class, lower income area in rural upstate New York. And now I also live in Westchester. I'm here, David and Ken, I'm in White Plains. And so, I kind of have like different perspectives to bring to this topic, especially because I also have been almost everywhere across the political spectrum as well. And my background is trained as my education is as a lawyer. I have a law degree and work now as a financial planner, a writer, and educator.
Thank you very much. Omega, introduce yourself, please.
Hey guys, I'm Omega Chambers. I'm originally from Los Angeles, California. Married. I have a wife and 5 children, 4, 7, 9, 11, and 14. My background is in retail and in finance, and I bring an interesting perspective to this from the standpoint that being from Los Angeles and growing up in the suburbs outside of Los Angeles in a place called Woodland Hills. I grew up in a community that was had a pretty good mix of different ethnicities and races and different backgrounds, and my high school was very much that way. So my perspective on what's going on today in today's world, particularly in this current tumultuous time that we're living in, is kind of broad, and I look forward to hearing what the rest of you guys have to say.
Thank you very much. And that is our fantastic crew for the day. And without any further ado, I will introduce the first question. Since the first question, I will allot 3 minutes to each speaker. The first question is as follows. How do you think that America's Black community is doing today when compared to the Jim Crow era? Are members of the Black community being held back in 2020 America? If yes, by whom and by what? David, please take it away.
Well, that is 4 questions, but we'll try to remember the last 3 after we do the first one. First of all, there is no one Black community. That's the very first thing we have to get out of the way, because the Black community that we see on television, the Black community that we see that sort of is stereotyped as the entire Black community in this country, poor urban ghetto areas with lots of poverty and lots of socioeconomic problems that go along with that. Certainly that's one group. You also have working class, non-union workers, you have working class union workers, you have professionals, you have doctors, you have lawyers, you have financiers, you have real estate people, you have everything under the sun. And so depending upon which group you're talking about, there are different issues, except for one. They can't escape their skin. So that no matter where you are, if you're, for example, if you're, Omega and you're looking to buy a house his walking in the door may make a difference whether or not he's able to buy that house. I don't have that problem. Ken doesn't have that problem. So there are different problems that go along with the socioeconomic class, but the skin color can't be missed. It's always there. As far as Jim Crow is concerned, well, most of the legal restrictions to freedom and justice are gone, but then there are all the loopholes. Then there are the attempts by governments to prevent people from voting and doing other kinds of things. There are redlining, for example, in buying a home or getting a loan is illegal, but it still exists. So, but it's sort of off the table and under the table and swept under the carpet, but it's still there. Obviously, we don't have lynchings anymore, we think, but obviously then you take a look at what's on the news and why do Black Lives Matter? Because there have been 400 years of violence and death against them that come across in different forms. What were the last two questions? What were the last two?
Are members of the Black community being held back in 2020 America? If yes, by whom and by what?
Okay. Again, yes and no. Those who have a financial ability to kind of leap forward, I think, are not held back in that regard. There's, if you have gotten the education, whether it's, a university education, whether it's at Howard or Yale or Stanford or USC or wherever it is, and you have the wherewithal to move forward, then you're going to have that opportunity. But the opportunity, everybody talks about a level playing field. It's not about a level playing field. It's about the ability to get to the level playing field. And some members of the Black community can get to the level playing field, and some can't. Who holds them back? It's not necessarily a who, it's more of a series of whats. Circumstances, level of poverty, the kind of education you get, where you get that education. Sociologically speaking, educational attainment is most exemplified by the mother's educational attainment level. I was surprised when I found that statistic, but that statistic is true. The education achievement is most likely correlated to mother's educational achievement. And so what those are going to be varied. And so it's kind of hard to say, but again, it's all subject to who you are, where you are, and what it is you're trying to get accomplished.
Thank you, David. Ken, take it away. Ken, can you unmute yourself, please? Here, I got you.
Got it. I'll start with your Tomer's question about changes since Jim Crow. Has anything changed? I do think that an awful lot has changed. The data is compelling. There is a middle class and growing middle class and upper middle class Black population. The Black population is still less affluent than the whites on average, but there has been progress made. Having said that, I believe strongly that there is systemic racism. As Dave pointed out, a lot has been done on the legal front to try to combat racism. But I still think that the system fosters racism and an unlevel playing field. Some of it, I'm not sure that it's all that intentional. I think, for example, when you talk about redlining, when you talk about mortgage rates, when you talk about insurance premiums, I look at the basis for these costs, and oftentimes it's based on formulas that may not make sense. I don't know that they're put in place maliciously, but I think that there is a need to change some of that to reflect the more modern era. I agree with Dave that there are lots of segments of the African-American population. There's not just one Black community. I do think, though, that, as Dave pointed out, I mean, you can't change the color of skin, and therefore, I think that certain things still go on. I speak with professional Black individuals, for example. I mean, there have been deans from my college who are African American, and they will still say that their kids, particularly their sons, will be stopped by the police. So, it is racism, whether it's intended or not. It is racism. It's tough to deal with some of that because, let's face it, if you look at from a police perspective, where is their crime? Where does it happen? It may be only a portion of the African American community, but that is where anybody would focus resources from a law enforcement standpoint. So some of these things are tough to overcome. My view of African Americans being held back is, they are being held back, a fair number of them. And some of it is, as Dave suggested, not by whom, but by what. I think that there are, for example, it's been shown that in terms of income and advancement, that children from two-parent households do far better than parents from one-child households. That is something that needs to be addressed, but is something where the African American community is holding itself back.
You should try to wrap up, Ken. You're past your time.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm past the time?
Yeah, just wrap up.
Okay. All right. I'll just leave it at that.
Thank you. Erik, take it away, please.
So it's a complicated question that you ask, because I think if you look at the Black community as Black people, and I'm going to go back to what I mean by that, I would definitely say Black people are better off in the sense that you don't have a lot of the legal barriers to advancement that you had in the Jim Crow era. But I think if you look at from another point of view, and I think Ken alluded to this, that you do see a higher number of children born without two married parents. And we know there's a lot of social ills that come with that. There's a lot of cultural ills that I think in some ways make the Black community as a whole, not everyone, worse off even to some extent than they were at that time. If you look at the economics of it, it's a bit mixed, because if you are, an educated person, so if you're an educated Black person, I think you're definitely doing much better now than you were in the past. If you're not, and I don't think this is unique to Black people, I think a lot of people are struggling and have been struggling really for 40 years, where we have seen the vast majority of income gains, to the very top 1% of the population, not necessarily because of anyone's fault, it's just what the data shows. A lot of Black people by that are not necessarily better off. So it's such a mixed picture. In terms of who's holding, Black people back, I don't think it has to do any more with people being held back because they are specifically Black. Of course, there's racism. I'm not saying that there is no racism, but the reality is that we're all discriminated against in different ways. I mean, the data shows, for example, that two people apply for the same job, and the taller person, all things being equal, is more likely than a shorter person. People that are overweight are discriminated against based on the accent you have, the way that you dress. We're constantly having bias and prejudices against almost everyone. And so while I do acknowledge that Black people do have a particular form of bias, I don't think it's enough to completely say that that's the reason we see the discrepancies that we do in terms of outcomes. I mean, as a simple example of this, people often talk about white privilege because it's true. White people on average make a higher income than Black people do on average, but Asian people have a higher income on average than white people. And we're going to say that's because of prejudice in favor of Asian people. So all I'm trying to say is it's really complicated. There's so many factors. It's a combination, yes, of prejudice, bias, both historical and current, but also just the difficulty that all people have of getting out of poverty. Again, my background is coming from an area with a lot of poor white people. So I saw that kind of poverty that had nothing to do with race. Some of it is also cultural. And so there's a whole mix of things, I think, that are holding people back in general.
Thank you. And right on time. Omega, take it away.
So to answer one of the questions, are Black people better off today than they were during the Jim Crow era? Obviously I wasn't alive during Jim Crow. I've read about it at length and am familiar with it. I would say that absolutely Black people are better off today than they were then, simply because of the fact that, you look at what happened in the 60s with the civil rights movement. A lot of things changed for Black people and a lot of other, communities that wouldn't be classified as white. So I definitely think without a doubt we're better off today. That's not to say that there aren't some issues that still need to be addressed and we need to continue to progress and move forward to address, some of the things that are going on in today's society that, do limit Black people's ability to be able to get out of poverty. But myself, my family, individuals that I know that are in the same age bracket, we are much better off than our grandparents were. So that's what I think about that. In regards to who or whom is holding Black people back, my response to that would be kind of what the two first speakers said. It's not so much as who as it is what. I think the biggest thing is that, African Americans unfortunately take on a victimization type of complex that, I think is instinctually, built in by way of, most of us that are here in this country that are African American or they're Black or descendants of slaves. So there's a certain level of, at a biological level, we look at that and we look, we want to point to everything and say it's racism or it's this or it's that. And it's like, well, that's not really what it is today. We live in a society where, it's economics, right? We live, that's the name of the game today. To the previous speaker's point, a lot of African American households are one parent households, right? And a one parent household, it means one income. So that in and of itself can be very limiting, which goes back to, there are more Blacks killed in this country from abortion than there are that are killed from, systemic racism in our criminal justice system. Not to say that, or to minimize that those things don't need to be addressed, but, I can't remember the exact statistic, but, there's been more Black babies killed in abortion clinics than at the hands of police officers. So, what's going on in our criminal justice system, I mean, you can change those things, but usually they're changed over time. They're not changed immediately. But abortion, right, that boils down to education and values and having, a strong family unit that teaches, hey, this is how we conduct ourselves. Hey, this is how we handle, these types of situations. And to wrap up my statement, I think if African-American people as a whole did a better job of taking personal accountability, right, for the things that are within their control, as a group, we would be better off.
Sorry, I muted myself. Thank you very much, Omega. And I think you guys raised really good points. And in general, I always really enjoy the way these conversations are held in a very civil manner. I'm going to try to orient the questions to touch upon the issues that you guys raised. So I'm going to start with something that David raised and ask the next question as follows. Oh, and by the way, a shameless plug, we do have a roundtable conversation about women's right to choose versus the appropriateness of aborting babies. So I will link below. The next question is as follows. How would you define the Black community in America? Are present-day African immigrants included? Are dark-skinned Latinos included? Are mixed-race people considered Black or white? Is the defining factor the skin color, how a person looks externally, or is it a common heritage of the slavery and Jim Crow era America? Take it away, David.
So this is one of those answers that is based upon who's answering it. Okay. For white Americans who don't see people of color very often, unfortunately, they all look alike. They all sound alike, depending upon where their accent is, whether it be from New York or it's down south. All right. That's somewhere the only thing that they're going to see. So I'm going to go back to my experiences growing up, okay, in the city of New York, where every neighborhood is about a block large. Okay. And so what happens is that, and this is very true now, especially because you brought in the very large African community that now lives in New York City, especially in the Bronx. There are entire sections of the Bronx that are filled with Africans, West Indians, and not just West Indians, depending upon what island they're from. You have Jamaican neighborhoods, you have Haitian neighborhoods, you have Trinidadian neighborhoods. You have all these various neighborhoods. And the same thing is true of Spanish-speaking people. It used to be when I was growing up, if you were Spanish, you were Puerto Rican, all right? Now you're Puerto Rican, you're Ecuadorian, you're Mexican, you're Dominican, you're anything. But to the outsider, you're all the same. So that's that matter of perspective. So if you go from neighborhood to neighborhood, you see the cultural differences. And some of the differences you see in storefronts, you see in restaurants, you see in foods, but you also see in how education, for example, is pursued. When I was teaching in the Bronx, and again, I'm just talking from personal experience, this is anecdotal, the most successful Black American students were those who came from West Indian ancestry, whose parents came from one of the West Indian countries, as opposed to those who came up to the New York area from the Southern migration. Now, there's a lot of ways to explain that. The same thing actually can be said about Italian Americans, for example. If you're an Italian American whose ancestry came from one of the northern cities, you were more likely to succeed in education than you were if you came from one of the southern rural areas. So there are those kinds of things. So all of those things have factors. And the problem is that if you're applying for a job, nobody knows what that background is. Nobody knows who you are. They're going to first judge you by your skin color or your accent. And
David,
that unfortunately levels the playing field in the wrong way.
Thank you very much, David. Ken, take it away, please.
Okay. Like David, I think that the first thing people see is skin color. And, I think there's a reason why we refer to, quote, people of color. And people of color we generally think of as African-American and Latino. I don't know that people think of Asians so much as people of color, notwithstanding, the tone of their skin color. I think that with that, though, I think that there are some things that play a further role. I think, for example, when we see people, I'll go back to African Americans. I think when you see kids with hoodies and who are, dressed and groomed a certain way, there is a reaction. I think it's a very different reaction when you see people who, in terms of grooming, apparel, etc., are, if you will, quote, more like us. Then all of a sudden, I think people are more willing to be accepting, and some of the prejudice goes away. What I wrestle with, though, in all this, while there's certainly been advancements for the African American population, I'm sort of a data nut, and my career, I spent a number of years in consumer products marketing, and was sort of a pioneer in terms of multicultural marketing to Blacks, marketing to Latinos. And the one thing to me that sets those groups apart is the Latinos very much about a generation after they get to the United States are pretty much spot on U.S. averages on most measures, on education, on income, whereas the African-American community on average has continued to lag. Again, certainly there's been advancements, and there are multiple segments of the population.
And can you try to wrap up, Ken, because you're past your time?
Okay, I think that I think that largely covers it. Thank you.
Thank you. Erik, take it away, please.
Yeah, I do think race is primarily thought of as about appearance. And so I would include African immigrants as part of the Black community. It's part of one of the reasons I actually don't like the term personally African American, because I think there is a huge cultural difference between someone who came here recently or their family from Africa versus people that have been here for many generations. And of course, that gets complicated because you could also have, white people that came from Africa. There's a large population specifically in South Africa, and then people, in Egypt. I mean, does that count? So it gets really murky. But I guess the larger point of the question, I would like us to, and this might be utopian and idealistic, but to really get beyond even thinking about ourselves in these different categories. And it might be because of me as being multiracial, feeling that way. I kind of being my own bias, I guess, because I've never felt like I was in one particular race. Although the way that it's commonly thought of, at least my understanding in the Black community, is that if you are part Black, you are Black. And that to try to say that you are something else is kind of almost seen as like a traitor. For example, Tiger Woods, saying, well, I'm part Black because my mom is Thai. He got a lot of heat for that. Obama was always described as a Black president, not a half Black president. And the reason for that is historically, if you were part Black, you were treated as Black under Jim Crow and under, a lot of racist policies. And so that is the historical tradition. And so the idea is to be, you don't want to try to like separate yourself from that because I would have been treated as a Black person at that time. But I do think we need to find a way, ideally, to try to get beyond that. As a quick example, I recently heard someone ask a question of, what do Rudy Giuliani and Nancy Pelosi have in common? And everyone would give answers, well, they're both politicians, they're older, there's always thing. And the person said, no, they're both Italian Americans. And it's right there in the name, but nobody thinks about that anymore. And, if the Martin Luther King dream was that, for people not to be judged on the color of their character, on their color, but on the content of their character, I would really like eventually for us to even get beyond thinking about people in racial terms at all. I don't know how possible that is. And I know there are people who would say that that's not even desirable, but that's, kind of what I think we want to be moving towards.
Just like Star Trek. Omega, take it away, please.
Okay. I'll start off with, unfortunately, people do see color still here in the United States of America. I think that, what we would call African American is different from a cultural standpoint than someone who just came here from Africa. And even, Black Africans who come here, will make the distinction that they're not African American because, culturally, maybe their family weren't descendants of slaves and, came here that way. So there's definitely a difference to the two previous speakers' points. If you're hiring someone in my previous job, I got to, part of what I did was, hire and deal with HR and things like that. And, me personally, I didn't look at things that way. But I can tell you as someone who would be put into the African American or Black box that, a lot of times the first things that people see is to see the fact that, okay, this guy, looks like what I believe to be a Black person is. And to David's point, that, can sometimes work against you, but once people get to know me and I open up my mouth and I start talking, then they quickly realize, oh, okay, this is, their preconceived notion of what they think somebody of color is. Obviously, the person standing in front of them is not that. So that kind of goes out the window, and it's like, well, what is he? Is he mixed? Is there something else in there? He's light skinned, he has green eyes. Like, how come this person standing in front of me is not matching up with what I have believed to be what a person of color is? So that's what I would say to that. To the last speaker's point, and I think I would just love for our culture to get past looking at one another in terms of, what color our skin is, or our, ethnic background, or whatever that may be, that we're all human beings and we need to just see another human being first. Very similar to Star Trek, which was written by Gene Roddenberry. I mean, his idea of what society hopefully one day will become is probably the way that, we need to go, because where we're moving right now in accelerated pace is, is very tribalistic. My tribe versus your tribe. I'm a Laker fan, you're a Boston Celtics fan. Blue lives matter, Black lives matters. Trump, Biden. I mean, it's like, if you're not with us, then you're bad, and we have to destroy you. And
Omega,
and that doesn't.
Can you try to
Sure.
wrap up?
Yeah. And that type of ideological framework doesn't work well for us. For at least the people, it doesn't work.
Thank you very, very much, guys. By the way, as a side note, Star Trek had the first interracial kiss on screen. I don't know if everybody remember that.
Yeah.
I'm going to move to the next question. It was raised by something that Ken raised. The concept of systemic racism has become increasingly popular in recent years. Can you explain the difference between racism and systemic racism? Do you think that racism exists in America today? Do you think that systemic racism exists in America today? How do you believe these issues affect the Black community, and what do you think that we should do about these issues? Is that okay, or do I need to repeat the question? Just nod if you feel that it's okay. David, I can't hear you. You want me to repeat? I take it you want me to repeat. I'll go over it again. The concept of systemic racism has become increasingly popular in recent years. Can you explain the difference between racism and systemic racism? Do you think that racism exists in America today? Do you think that systemic racism exists in America today? How do you believe that racism and systemic racism affect the Black community today? And what do you think should be done about these issues? David, please take it away. 2 minutes each speaker. You know what? Let's allot 3 minutes, Dave, because I feel like it's a big question and you might want to address it more in depth.
Okay, thanks. Well, yes, they both exist. They're wrapped up in one another. So when we say, systemic versus systematic, there's a difference. If we talk systematically, if institutions have bias and make decisions based upon those bias, then that's clear. But when you talk about a system, well, there's an American system. It's an American system, a set of values, a set of ways of expressing ourselves physically, orally, even with eye contact, looks, those kinds of things. Who am I giving a side eye to? Who am I walking across the street to the other side? So it begs to answer the question, to what extent are we individuals, or individuals part of an American culture? So since we're part of an American culture, which is comprised of God knows how many subcultures, everything we do is in part systemic, because it depends upon the subcultures we grew up in and how much of that general American culture has kind of infiltrated the way we were brought up, how we were socialized. So since we're all socialized, there's systemic racism in every one of us. And how it appears, that's going to be where it's going to be individual. So sometimes it's very subtle. It's like, I don't even know I'm doing it, but there it is. And other times it's going to be right smack in your face, literally a smack in your face, all right? Or a gun in your face, or things to that nature. Now, how do they affect the Black community? Again, go back to that other first question, which Black community? And that's, again, it's going to differ Poor blacks, young male blacks see it the worst, okay? Because they see how they're approached by the representatives of institutionalized America, mostly cops, teachers, firemen even, sanitation workers, all the representatives of our systems, so to speak. They're going to be more likely, certainly I'm not getting pulled over for driving while black, okay? Even though I might be speeding along on a highway. And, and some 25-year-old black guy is going from his house in Newark, driving down to Rutgers on the New Jersey Turnpike, gets pulled over and says, "Why are you pulling me over?" And the next thing you know, he's got a gun in his face. So, but another cop might not do that. So why and where, it all is wrapped up in one another. What can be done? Well, we've been trying to deal with that question for a hell of a long time. And I agree with Omega that obviously things change over time. And Ken mentioned it too. These are slow, progressive kinds of steps that have to be taken. The fact that people can walk in neighborhoods they could not walk in before happens far more often, except maybe if you're trying to jog through a neighborhood just outside of Atlanta and you get shot by two guys in a white pickup. So it's really hard to say that. What can be done? What we can each individually do is the most important thing, and how we can affect those people around us to try to end how we disparage or how we affect people in a negative way when they are not like us.
Thank you very much, David. Ken, please take it away.
Okay, and Tomer, you said 3 minutes? Okay. First off, I think that racism and systemic racism are two different things, and I think that both exist. Let's face it, not everybody is racist, but there are still examples of people that are. There still are people that, take a vigilante attitude toward things, or just plain don't want, integration in their communities or whatever. That is racism. In my mind, systemic racism is less about intentional obstacles, but more about obstacles that do exist in our society. And I think that they're very real. I'll give you an example that I saw a number of years ago. Was working in a small consulting firm. And the head of the consulting firm said he just could not hire a black employee because if the person didn't work out, he couldn't terminate them. That's systemic racism. I see it with this family that we've largely adopted. We help them to move to a better school district, to get the kids into schools for quality education. But I look at a situation where, for example, our adopted daughter, she had a big car problem and had a major engine overhaul to be done. And frankly, she was overcharged for it. It was not done right. And I do think that, people, whether it's just lower income or whether it's, has a racial cast to it, are not treated fairly in a lot of ways. To me, that's systemic racism. Another form of systemic racism is I look at the notion of one-parent versus two-parent households. And one of the reasons, at least that I've heard, for a lot of the one-parent households is that enables, whether it's more Section 8 housing, welfare benefits, etc. But that gets to a systemic racism problem, which is our welfare policies and our tax policies in this country basically say, as you move up, we are going to pull that rug out from under you very quickly. So, for example, somebody who's been receiving various forms of government benefits, as their income goes up, it could be that they lose effectively 60 to 80 cents out of every dollar because they're losing benefits at such a fast clip as their income goes up. It's not smart policy, and it may not be intentionally intended to hold people of color back, but it is, because those economic advances are gradual advances as well, but they sure would be helped by having people who feel like they're more part of the mainstream, that they're not always one step away from a crisis because of financial limitations. So I think that all of those things are a part of systemic racism in our society.
Thank you very much, Ken. Erik, take it away, please.
So my understanding of systemic racism is it's policies or institutions that have a disparate impact on Black people in a negative way. So I guess from that definition, it obviously exists. I don't think it's a useful construct, though, to think about a lot of these issues. So let me give you an example of what I mean by that. We could say that our healthcare system is racist because Black people are less likely to have health insurance and therefore less likely to get the care that they need. I don't think that's a helpful way to talk about something that affects people across different lines of color. I think we have a problem with our healthcare system. Yes, it has a greater impact on Black people. Part of that is economic. Part of it may be a result of especially historical racism that resulted in the economic conditions that you see. And when you look at a situation like law enforcement, which is where I think it's often talked about now in that context, again, I think it was, in my opinion, a big mistake to focus on the racial aspects instead of just the issue of police abuse. And the reason I say that is when we talk about healthcare, we don't say, Black patients matter. When we talk about education, we don't say Black students matter. Even though those things are true, Black people suffer more from poor schools, poor educational outcomes. But from a political standpoint, I think it's much more helpful to look at, let's fix this problem for everyone, and understanding that, of course, it's going to have a bigger disparate impact on people who are more negatively impacted by it, which includes Black people. If you look at law enforcement, a lot of poor areas, again, like where I grew up, they complain too about law enforcement. For every shooting of an unarmed Black person, you could find a shooting of an unarmed white person in almost identical situation. And the data on this is it doesn't find the huge disparities that you would expect to find, especially when it comes to actual police shootings. You do find that there is more use of force against Black suspects, but we don't know if there is more resistance. So a lot of this stuff is very murky. But my larger point is that it's not that helpful. I do think it would help to end the drug war as something that definitely hurts not just Black people, but people in general with law enforcement. It encourages, gangs. It helps fund them. Just like the prohibition of alcohol was very helpful helpful for crime, for organized crime at the time of Prohibition. And there it was, largely the Irish community that was impacted by that. So, but again, I don't think that these issues need to be racialized. I don't think it's very helpful in the discussion.
Thank you, Erik. Perfect timing. Omega, take it away.
All right. What were the questions again? Repeat them for me.
The concept of systemic racism has become increasingly popular in recent years. Can you explain the difference between racism and systemic racism?
Okay.
And the latter part of the question is, do you think that they exist in America today, both racism and systemic racism? How do you believe these issues affect the Black community, and what do you think should be done?
So racism and systemic racism, both, they obviously exist. The way that I think of racism versus systemic racism is, racism, and use an example like a police officer, pulling someone who would be considered a person of color because they're a person of color. David used the example driving while Black, DWD. That's racism like at the very lowest level. Systematic racism is, to Ken's point, being institutionalized where there are systems put in place that are deliberately designed to keep, whatever background or group of people that you want out. I think both of them exist. I think that we've come a long way since the Jim Crow era and since, the 1950s and 60s, things have progressed. But that's not to say that, we live in a perfect society. There does need to be criminal justice reform. There are more blacks and Hispanics in this country that are incarcerated in comparison, to whites. That needs to change, right? And a lot of the reasons why these people are incarcerated aren't because of their high-level offenders or have done things that are completely heinous. They're very low-level offenses, which, our current president has actually done a great job to kind of change some of those things with, criminal justice reform. But going back to what I previously said, I think the best thing for us and for our society is to stop thinking about things in this way. For Black people, again, the biggest thing is, the Black community as a whole has been convinced that there's a boogeyman, and the boogeyman is out to get them. And to some degree, that is true, right? But for most Black people walking around, the boogeyman is not waiting for them around the corner, right? There isn't some, to use the police example again, a white police officer, right, just waiting in a squad car somewhere hunting Black people, right? That's simply not the case. That's not to say that, Black people are sometimes shot wrongly in police altercations, but that's not limited to Black people either. That happens to a lot of people. And again, you look at the statistics, you're more likely to be killed by another Black person than you are by a police officer. So why this has become so polarizing and why it's been pushed to the front of the line again, I think there's more to it than just, people wanting to prop it up like, oh, we need to move towards social justice reform and change. I think that a lot of what we see, at least today, which is part of the reason we're having this conversation, is by design and it's on purpose for an agenda to create, civil unrest and to pit one another against each other, especially the Black community, to embolden them to think that they're being hunted. I mean, you have LeBron James saying that, that the Black community is afraid to go out of their homes. I mean, that's completely absurd. I'm a Black man. I'm not afraid to go out of my house. Right? I'm not afraid if a police officer pulls me over. Right? There's a certain way that you're supposed to act when you deal with police officers, no matter what color of skin you are. Right? I have friends that are in law enforcement. You don't want to challenge these people's authority. Right? No cop likes that. So there's just I think if people could just have a certain etiquette and decency, that eliminates a lot of what we see. Not to say that there are things that happen that aren't good.
I'm going to have to ask you to start wrapping up. You're past your time.
Sure. That's not to say that, there aren't bad things that happen, but, personal accountability goes a long way. And I'll end with this. LeBron James is a multi-millionaire who lives a different life than me and the average Black person. For him to say that we're afraid to include him in that, I'm afraid to go out. You're not afraid of anything, dude. It's ridiculous.
Thank you very much. We're moving back to 2 minutes. By the way, if any of you feels that any round you feel very strongly you want to address it again, then just raise your hand when I pick up the microphone, and we'll do a quick lightning round of 1 minute on the same issue. The next question addresses things that were raised by David and Erik. Recent African immigrants are quite successful in the United States and much more successful when compared to American-born Black communities. Why do you think this is so? Do you think that Black culture affects the success of Black Americans? David.
Again, I think it's pretty much parallel to what I said before in terms of West Indian Black Americans as opposed to African Americans currently from Africa, or African immigrants, I probably would say is the best, either first or second generation. But even there, again, I'm gonna constantly point this out. I'm loath to group people together, as you could see. Even there are differences. I've had students from various parts of Africa. I've had students from the same country in Africa who have been oppressed and their families subject to torture by other members of that same country because they were of different tribal backgrounds and because they were different cultural backgrounds and different religious backgrounds. So again, when we want to lump everybody together and say, are more African immigrants successful? I think, they're immigrants, they choose to come. They choose to come because there's opportunity. And again, depending upon who they were before they left and what their personal family values are, what their own tribal cultures are, by the way, because there's various differences in those as well, they're going to push to be successful. And again, there's an area in the High Bridge in the Bronx that I'll point to and you can go to, and you see loads and loads and loads of successful retail stores in African immigrant neighborhoods. You're going to see lots of people in universities. You see, interestingly enough, you see more African last names on the backs of jerseys in professional sports. And all of these things are evidence of their particular cultures when they get here. But there are also poor African immigrants as well. So that's the problem when we talk about generations of color, as opposed to migrants from the South who never escaped the backgrounds of slavery, the backgrounds of sharecropping, the backgrounds of Jim Crow, the backgrounds of poor rural existence, and then coming to an urban area, trying to figure out how to fit in and not having necessarily the ability to do that over several generations. And when that goes
I'm
over,
going to have to ask you to start wrapping up.
Got it. And when that happens for several generations, it's even harder to break that.
Thank you very much. Ken?
Okay. I think there are some fundamental differences between people we term as African Americans, if you will, versus African immigrants. And I think part of it goes, if we look at African immigrants, they have come to this country recently specifically for the American environment and opportunity, specifically to have a better life. That is very different than someone who's here because their parents, their grandparents, their great-grandparents, etc., were here and were brought here because of slavery. So the historical backgrounds are so dramatically different. I think that in addition, and here's one where I have no data at all, but I'm going to guess that the Africans who come here more, tend to have greater incidence of two-parent households being brought up in a different way versus the large number of single-parent households in the, quote, African-American population. So I think the two are quite different. I think if you look at the United States, and we're a country of people who are of immigrants, whether we've been here for one generation, two, three, whatever. And, I look at myself, and my grandparents were poor immigrants. My mother had to live in an orphanage for a period of time because her parents couldn't afford to support their kids. But they came here, A, to escape from Eastern Europe, and B, to have a better life. And within a generation, those things were taking place. So I think the background, family background, motivations for being here play a huge role in differences that we see.
Thank you very much, Ken. Erik?
So I do think that's a really interesting and important statistic. Or to make it anecdotal for a moment, sometimes I like to think about, who are the three African, or how to say, let's say Black Americans that either became president or came closest to it, arguably. And I would say would be Colin Powell, Barack Obama obviously made it, and Kamala Harris, all three, children of immigrants. I do think, the immigrant experience is not unique to immigrants from Africa. I think it's exactly what, David and Ken said. It's a different mindset of when you're coming to here. because you want to, and because you have that mindset. And I think a lot of children of immigrants will also say that they do feel a pressure, whether it's overt or not, from parents to succeed, knowing what their parents did to come here, to give them a better life. But I also think this demonstrates just how important culture is. I don't think it's unique to immigrants. Amy Chua, she's well known as the author of the Tiger Mom book. She wrote a whole book talking about different groups that have been particularly successful in America. She purposely wanted to use different ethnicities, and Nigerians were one of the groups that were highlighted. But she also interestingly had Mormons as a group. So that's not an immigrant group. And looking at what these different cultures have in common to help them succeed. So on the one hand, I completely think that's true, that culture matters a lot. But I don't think it's not the only thing. I think it's a combination of culture, and I think class and economics matter a lot too. And I think it's not an either or, I think it needs to be a both. But I think the focus on racism as an explanation for people's outcome is probably the least useful. I'm not saying racism doesn't exist. Racism obviously exists. But of the three, I would actually say that that's probably the least important.
Thank you very much. Punctual as usual. If you want to have another round, David, we'll have another round after this. Okay, but now it's Omega's turn.
Right. So I would say that culture definitely plays a huge role, and this conversation and what we're talking about, and it certainly does matter. There are aspects of the African-American culture, Black culture, that produce systematic poverty in and of itself, right? And it goes back to what I've been saying, in previous topics, that personal accountability. The Black community, has to take a hard look in the mirror and say, hey, you know what? There are some aspects of our culture that are toxic to us, and that we need to adjust those things. One thing for certain is the music. If you listen to not all rap or hip hop, but a lot of it, what it glorifies is, robbing and killing and the objectification of women, and things that can't possibly produce good traditional nuclear families. Right? Cardi B, I'm sure you guys are all familiar with her. She has a song called WAP. If you look at the lyrics of what WAP is, and she's just one example, but she's a prominent person in the hip hop and rap R&B world. And there are a lot of Black people that listen to that music. There are a lot of people that aren't Black that listen to that music. And if that's who we're going to hold up as our example, Black people are in trouble. That is a problem. How can anyone on the global stage take a group of people seriously when the people that we glorify, right, the people that we push to the front of the line, we say, hey, speak for us, this is who our heroes are, right? That doesn't work. That doesn't work. Culturally, we have some issues, and when I talk to other Black people, right, that's something that, a lot of them don't want to hear about or talk about. It's always something else. They blame shift to the boogeyman or to the white man, or they're out to get us, or Trump's bad, or Biden this, or George Bush that. Fill in the blank with whatever you want. No, culturally, we have some issues. The music is a really, really big deal. I mean, I can't remember who said this quote, but I'm going to paraphrase it.
Omega, I'm going to have to ask you to start wrapping up. You're past your time.
Sure. Something to the extent that you can judge a culture by the type of music it listens to. And that is a very, 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 very true statement. Our music is toxic in a lot of different ways. And that's something that we need to address from a culture standpoint.
I got the feeling that David wants to have a second round on this issue. Was I correct, David?
Yeah, it's just a couple of...
Okay, so wait 1 second. We're going to have another lightning round. We're going to go through everybody again, but this time we're only going to have 1 minute, okay? And please, because we have a lot of issues to touch upon, then when the bell rings, start wrapping up of your own accord, because we want to allow everybody to speak their mind. David, take it away, please.
Sure. It was actually Erik's mention of Colin Powell, who grew up in my neighborhood. And it has to actually deal with the idea of what an integrated neighborhood can be. it was an integrated neighborhood at the time. And we know that economic and racial integration and living in mixed communities has been shown to be most successful to rid us of racist attitudes and achieve educationally. The other part of this comes from a book that is 30 some odd years old, William Julius Wilson, The Truly Disadvantaged, who talked about a neighborhood in Chicago where he's from, and how the loss of jobs in what was primarily a black neighborhood that had every class represented, all right, destroyed the neighborhood when the upper classes of that black neighborhood were left and basically created an underclass neighborhood, what we now call urban, which changed the music from R&B, the Temptations, to Carly, Cardi B. So all those things get wrapped up together.
Ken, thank you, David.
I think as well with all of this, I come back to family structure, and I come back to the absence too often of effective mentorship in the black community. It's the sort of thing I see, for example, in our involvement with a family of color, where it's, the financial help we provide is important. It helps to open up opportunities. But a part of what we're doing is about mentorship for somebody who didn't have parents who could teach her about, disciplines, life management disciplines, financial disciplines. I've seen statistics on this that say when people have additional money in their pocket, it is spent much faster among the African-American community than among the white community. That is all about learning from your parents or from somebody who can teach you the merits of saving, prioritization, personal.
Ken, I'm going to have to ask you to wrap up, please.
Yep. And so I think that is a major issue, is just teaching basic life management skills.
Thank you, Ken. Eric, please.
All I want to say is I'm glad to hear that there is, discussion about the fact that it's not purely all about racism. Of course, we all agree racism is an issue, but there are other factors. And one thing I just wanted to mention was this: there is a growing idea now that to even hint that there could be a cultural or other aspect in addition to racism is now being called racist. That a lot of the discussion now is basically to even hint at anything else, you could be accused of being a racist or white supremacist, and I think that's really sad.
Thank you, Eric. Omega?
Yeah, going back to what Ken said is, financial literacy is a big thing. Unfortunately, isn't taught in public schools. It's not really taught at all unless you have parents to teach it to you, which goes to family structure. Or if you have a private school education, they do teach that when you get into, like the 10th and the 11th grade. Money management skills are key. Certain life disciplines are key to be able to have the precursors that are necessary in order to build a life so that you can run a business and have success and do things. And that is lacking in the Black community due to, the way the families are structured, which you could point to a number of things. Abortion is a big deal. Kids are never born, right? They don't have a chance, right? If you incentivize a Black mother not to marry a Black father, right, with money, then you got the systematic breakdown of the family right there in and of itself. And if the dad is chasing WAP, right, if that's what his focus is on, then, makes it hard to raise sons and to teach them the things that used to be taught, by my grandparents and my great-grandparents. I was taught those things, but I grew up with a lot of kids where they didn't have the benefit of learning any of that.
Thank you very much, Omega. I sense that you have a great love of Cardi B's artistic talent. I want to follow up with something that was raised by both Omega and Ken. single parenthood birth rates in the Black community have increased from under 20% in 1940 to over 75% today. Over 75% of children born today are born to single parenthood homes. Pregnancy rate for Black American teenage girls is disproportionately higher than the adolescent pregnancy rates for other ethnicities. What do you think are the causes of these statistics? Do you think that this state of events negatively affect the Black community? Why? And what do you recommend to be done, if anything? David, 2 minutes. Take it away.
Wow. I'm going to kind of start from the back end of that. I have no idea how to solve this problem because it's been increasing and getting, I mean, when you talk about the differences from the 1940s to now, that took a while to get here. I think it has to do a lot with what Omega was talking about, the change in cultural values. It also has to do a lot with what I was saying before about the destruction of economically integrated neighborhoods where you had more two-family homes, two-parent homes. And again, that's part of what I was mentioning before. Where those exist, I guess if there's a solution for it, there are groups who are trying to reinstate the idea of integration as opposed to desegregation. There's a whole difference to that. And so where you have those multicultural kinds of communities, you have built-in mentorship, you have peers, you have other kinds of things to more positively affect how kids see themselves, how they decide what to do, as opposed to what William Julius Wilson was talking about, the destruction of those communities. So all you end up with is an underclass with its own subset of underclass values, where those kinds of behaviors are by girls are looked upon as being measures of success, the way gang membership and gun use is also looked upon as a measure of success by young Black males. So they each have their own subcultural set of values that have been created by that turn for the worse in terms of what neighborhoods were like. And I mentioned in the chat, yeah, Colin Powell came from my neighborhood. So did J-Lo and so did Cardi B. And you can see the degeneration within those generations, all right, in a lot more things than just music. And I think that has a lot to do with it.
Ken, take it away, please.
Dave, I hope you're not criticizing J-Lo. She's one of my favorites. But, you know, I think the issue of single-parent households, I think, is huge. In fact, I don't think that it is necessarily race-based, even though the incidence is disproportionately great in the African-American community. Everything that I read says that nowadays marriage has become an upper middle class, upper income phenomenon. And I hear people regularly say, well, gee, I can't get married because we can't afford a wedding, or, you know, or whatever. And I think, again, I think the erosion of values cuts across races. I don't think it is strictly a racial matter. I do think, though, that there are things that we could do about it. When I talked before about welfare benefit and tax policies, for example, you know, instead of, if you will, punishing people and taking away so much because there's a second income, find ways to encourage that. Just like there is, you know, I'm going to forget the name of the term, but credits for employment, if you will. Find ways to make marriage and two-parent households more desirable financially. I think that what else can be done? I think if you look at leaders in the Black community, they need to step up and take a strong stand with people encouraging and pushing the, you know, the family structure. And I think as well that Dave mentioned it in terms of effective integration. I think that, for example, our own personal experience, taking somebody who first had two children out of wedlock, but encouraging and working with them, and in a way that now there is a father in the household. He may not be the biological father of both the children, but there is a male influence. There are two parents, two incomes, etc., and that goes a long way to fostering advancement. So, that's about all I have to add on that.
Thank you, Ken. Erik, take it away.
The thing I'd like to add here is that you're also seeing, and Ken alluded to this, a growing illegitimacy rate among white people too, and it's growing, especially in low-income areas. So I don't think it has anything necessarily to do with race. It's a huge problem, and I always like to think, that I have a conservative side and a liberal side, and my conservative side agrees with every point we've been talking about, that the need for cultural change and a cultural shift. But the reality is, the other side of me says, my liberal side says, you're always going to have people that are going to be in that situation. In this case, we're talking about children that it was no fault of their own. And I do think we can take steps to alleviate child poverty as well. Something like a child allowance, kind of like a UBI for children, so to speak, to really, I think a goal should be to eliminate child poverty, because regardless of what you think the reasons of poverty are, children clearly are not responsible for being in poverty. So we need to kind of strengthen the safety net for those people that need it, but at the same time, emphasize, those values culturally that help people advance. And that's why I keep saying it's not an either or, it's a both and.
Thank you, Erik. Omega.
Question one more time. I'm always at the end, so I get caught up in my own thoughts.
That's fine. Single parenthood birth rates in the Black community have increased from under 20% in 1940 to over 75% today. Pregnancy rate for Black American teenage girls is disproportionately higher than the adolescent pregnancy rate for other ethnicities. What do you think are the causes of these issues? Do you think they negatively affect the Black community? Why so? What do you recommend be done, if anything? Got
it. Well, I'll start with WAP. WAP is a problem. Going back to what I originally said, I use it as an example because it's a good one. You look at, again, going back to the music, if, I have a daughter, right? My daughter doesn't listen to that kind of music at all, and she's very, very little. But, if the women of the Black community or any community, if that's what they're being indoctrinated with, that's their focus, right? Whether they know it or not, when you listen to music, you're being programmed, right? You're being programmed with something. You listen to classical music, that has feelings of, relaxation for a lot of people. You listen to rock and roll music, that'll usually hype you up. You listen to rap and hip hop, that'll usually get you ready to want to do one of a few things, depending on what kind of rap or hip hop you're listening to. The music on the culture has a huge impact. I think that those are things that need to change. Also, entertainment is a big thing that kind of plays into this. You look at the new Netflix series that came out called Cuties. I'm sure we're all familiar with that. That's an issue. That's an issue. And I think that's part of why, to I believe Ken's point, that you see, the women in the Black community, since they don't have maybe something else to aspire to, right? They aspire to objectify themselves to being the best in the arena of things that are supposed to be intimate between a husband and a wife, which goes back to what Ken said again about value system. You have the systematic breakdown of the value system at home because there aren't two parents. Moms are trying to be mom and dad, that's not the way that it was designed or intended to be, in my opinion. And, here we are today with a lot of the issues that you see that we're having. And then, these young ladies, by way of not having a dad or having strong male leadership around them, don't know what to do. They get pregnant. The school system, right? In California, part of what they just passed, other than the age of consent is that, the school administration can take your kids and talk them into, going to a planned pregnancy center and have an abortion if you're pregnant. That's a problem without the consent of someone's parents. That's nuts. That's batshit crazy. Excuse my language. That shouldn't be. And again, if you had strong families and a strong nucleus there, like the Hispanic community, their communities are strong. I think, David, you had mentioned that before, Ken, their communities are very strong. And our community as a whole at the moment isn't.
Thank you very much, Omega. I swear, y'all just like talking smack about Cardi. Right, our next question, issues raised by both David and Omega. 2 minutes for this question. Incarceration rates in the Black community are at much higher rates than their comparative representation in the general population. Why do you think that this is the case? How do you think that affects the Black community, and what do you think should be done about it? David, take it away.
Yeah, so incarceration rates are hugely greater in the Black community. In education, there's always the talk about the school education pipeline, the school prison pipeline. It exists. Now, it's not a formal thing. I don't know if it's even systematic, but it's certainly there. And why does that happen? Well, I think Omega mentioned it earlier. Somebody mentioned it. The arrests for low crimes, possession, smoking a joint on the corner, the whole difference between the way crack was handled and cocaine was handled, those made for huge differences. The whole war on drug thing has systematically affected poor Black communities more than it has, obviously, the wealthy guys driving around in the Porsches and, doing a line every once in a while, obviously. So that's a big thing. But again, the other part of that is the increase in the use of violence, the increase in the use of guns, the increase in the use of the increase in gang membership, all of those things which create their own little, I'm going to go back to my sociological background, create these own little subcultures where crime is actually a way of expressing your manhood. And then you get caught. And then you're in prison. And once you're in the prison system, the way they're set up now, you don't get out. And if you do get out, you get out because you've already been trained to be even more of a criminal than you were when you went in. Because who are your peers? Who are the people who you're dealing with? Who are your mentors? What's going on in there? The only turnarounds you see in prison are those that I've seen who have taken up faith, regardless of what faith it is, whether it be Christianity or Islam, which are the two that are usually taken up in prisons. Those are the only kids that I've seen come out of prison with real moral and cultural changes in how they approach things. It's very difficult. So how to do that? We've got to approach it on the incoming end in terms of how to get kids from school to job, not from school to prison. And we've got to talk about how to do that, as a high school teacher and as a high school mentor and as somebody who still mentors high school kids, even though I'm retired. That's a really important factor because you got to counteract all the other stuff that's going on. And in prisons, we've got to figure out to make them more rehabilitative and not punitive.
Thank you, David. Ken, take it away.
Okay. I'm going to say some things that are fairly consistent with what Dave said. I think that the high incidence of imprisonment among Black males, a part of it is, a part of it reflects systemic racism. The difference in, whether it's crack cocaine versus, whatever the good stuff is. I'm ignorant about all this, but clearly, violation of the law with one form of a drug versus another form leading to very different lengths of imprisonment is clearly, it's systemic. Whether it was necessarily intentional or not, it is systemic. On the other hand, you do have to look again at self-accountability or community accountability when you see the much higher incidence of imprisonment among young black males. And a part of it is that there is more crime being done by these people. A part of it is that if you're living in a neighborhood where you have to protect yourself, where, I think Dave suggested that, being macho or doing certain things is required to be respected, if you will, it simply leads to more crime. I think as well, though, that the poor quality of education in the a lot of the urban areas has a big impact, as well as, again, coming back to the notion of culture and family structure, et cetera. So there's not a simple answer, but it does follow people once they have been imprisoned. We see it, for example, the fathers of both of the children that call me grandpa. Both fathers have been in prison. One has struggled to stay out since, and frankly, he gets screwed along the way, because anything happens that violates a parole requirement or again, systemic racism can grab you and make you very vulnerable to being imprisoned again through no fault of your own necessarily. So, I mean, it is a complex issue.
Thank you. Erik?
It is a complex issue. I definitely agree with that. I think a lot of crime is because people feel they don't have opportunities, and they feel like this is the best they can do is get involved, in gangs and the drug trade. So I guess what I would be looking at is, number one, I do think we should be ending the war on drugs. I think, as there's always going to be a demand for illicit drugs. Yes, as Ken pointed out, there are discrepancies, or there were. I think a lot of that has been addressed. But in terms of sentencing and things, but there's still always going to be a larger issue that as long as you make drugs illegal, and there's always going to be a demand for them, someone's going to fill that, and it's going to be by definition something illegal. And if there's money to be made, someone's going to be making that money. And again, you saw the same thing with alcohol prohibition. I don't think it's anything unique to the drug trade today. So that would be one thing. Another thing is the perception of this, and this is the thing Omega talked about, this victimhood mindset, I don't think is helpful to people. And I think this is what helps a lot from people who are immigrants and children of immigrants, but not unique to them, is the idea that if you tell someone that they have no opportunity and no hope, and the whole country, hates them, and and of course, people are not going to try hard to succeed in a system that you think is completely stacked against you. So on the one hand, yes, we should try to make the system as less stacked against people as we can. But at the same time, we need to make people aware that there are opportunities to be taken advantage of. And then there's also my liberal side, which says, just like I think we should have a child allowance, I think there's an argument for wage subsidies of low income wages so that people can be paid more. So that on the one hand, we want to remove the incentive to be selling drugs, because you're not going to make money selling a product that people can buy legally now. And on the other hand, you want to give people more of an incentive to work by increasing the rewards of work. And I think wage subsidies can help do that. And once people start on the ladder of working and they're building job skills and getting experience, they can start climbing that ladder.
Thank you, Erik. Omega.
All right. I think education is one of the things that can go towards, helping on this particular topic. If you look at the urban areas is what they're called now, to David's point, I believe he said that, you don't have a lot of tax dollars, right, in those areas. And since you don't have a lot of tax dollars, which is how you fund public schools, the schools that are in the inner city are worse off than, say, the schools in the suburbs. There's got to be a way to change that to where, you know, you look at California, that's where I'm from, you know, their state proposed budget for 2021 is something like, I can't remember the exact statistic, I don't have it written down in front of me. It's billions of dollars. It's like over $1.5 billion, right, for education. That's huge, right? But then you got a state that every year runs a deficit, right? Now, you know, how do you have, for the sake of our conversation, $1.5 billion, right, that goes towards education, and then you still have either the worst or one of the worst public school systems in the country, right? With that amount of money to throw at an issue, there's got to be a better way to effectively, you know, manage the funds that we do expend towards, you know, schooling to give people the education and literacy and the things that they need so that they can be able to thrive. Otherwise, you know, to the previous speaker's point, Erik, you know, kids feel like they have nothing to turn to, right? And if you eliminate people's hope, you know, people will do anything once they think that there's no hope. And the truth of the matter is that there is hope, that there is a better way. You know, America is not racist. People saying America was never great, those are not true statements. I have friends that are from communist places, right, that are from Armenia, that are from Bulgaria, that are from Russia, that understand what it's like to really have absolutely no opportunity. You have the mafia and you have the government. That's not here in the United States. Although there are some things that are built in, to conclude my point, that are systematically can be racist, you can overcome that. But you have to want to do it. And in order to want to do it, you've got to know that you can, and you have to have a strong family unit around you pushing you, saying, hey, you can. And then some of these other things that we've all been discussing, like education, right? You know, it can actually have a measurable impact on the individual, which can change the community.
Thank you, guys. Again, we shall take into advisement your claim of ignorance regarding illicit drugs. We'll assume you're not related to Walter White. Our next question ties into the issue of incarceration. In the recent spate of civil unrest after the death of George Floyd by a police officer, there have been loud demands to defund the police. What is your opinion of the current state of law enforcement in the United States? How do you think it affects the Black community? What actions would you recommend be taken? David.
Okay, I'm going to actually start with the word defunding. Whoever thought of that word was a moron, all right? Because all it has done is put everybody off in the wrong direction. If you want to talk about police reform, all right, that's one thing. But as soon as you lay a negative connotation on somebody and humiliate who they are and what they do, you're going to get them, their mothers, their fathers, their grandparents, their uncles, their aunts, and everybody they know riling up against you, and that's not what we need. All right, end of that rant. All right. Secondly, I know a lot of cops. All right, I grew up with kids who became cops. The ones I grew up with became cops could have just as easily become criminals. Okay, and those are the guys who I would watch out for. On the other hand, a lot of my students who I taught in the Bronx also became cops. But they're different, because most of the kids who I taught who became cops were kids of color. They were Black. They were Puerto Rican. And they were from the community and policed their own community. And it was a whole different attitude. New York Times had a thing, I think it was just the other day, about where New York City cops live and how the Policemen's Benevolent Association, the union leadership, doesn't really represent the fact that fewer than half of cops in New York City are white. All right. And so there's also that discrepancy. And when you look at cops, you got to look at their color too, because anybody who represents their community and lives in their community is going to have a greater stake in terms of how it's policed than those who live outside in neighborhoods where a Black person might not want to actually enter. So that has a lot to do with it. There was in a lot of communities, I know that there have been movements to have police live within the area that they're policing. That's great, but you have to provide affordable housing for them to do it, because they don't get paid enough in New York City to afford to live in areas in New York City where they are. So I think, again, being part of the community helps. Understanding the community helps. Training not to shoot to kill helps. All of those things. And again, when you see what happened to George Floyd, well, they're taught not to use that knee to the neck technique, but the guy went and did it anyway.
David seems to have frozen. So Ken, we will move on to you.
There is oh yeah, I think I just got it.
Okay, so just wrap up because you just hit your time limit.
I just got an unstable connection. I just want to
finish
this
just
last
finish.
thing. The thin blue line, okay, the code of silence, that has to stop. I don't know how to do that. But when good cops, and most cops are good, are silent, they're not helping. They're hurting the situation.
Ken?
Okay. First, I agree with Dave. Defunding police, to me, is a total non-starter. I think as well, and I don't know what to do with this one. If we look, I think police reform, training, enforcing rules is critical. I think a part of the problem has been, frankly, that the police in most cases are unionized, and the unions will support and back up people regardless of their behavior far too often. That's a huge problem. So I think training and enforcement is right. On the other hand, I'm concerned with the pressure to make it far easier for police to be liable for behavior. There's a difference between intentional behavior and inappropriate behavior, and doing things at the split second, because frankly the cops have to make split second decisions. I look at the whole instance, for example, it just was in the newspapers today with Breonna Taylor in Louisville. And the police were trying to track down, apparently must have had some evidence about drug dealing or whatever that was taking place from her apartment. At least what's been reported is they knocked on the door repeatedly. They announced themselves when they came in, and then they were shot at and responded. It's easy. Look, it's easy to say, he said, she said, and this one says this one says that. But I think the presumption that the police acted inappropriately and therefore shall be held accountable is simply a presumption that should not always be the case. I think that in a lot of these communities, the political leadership has not made clear enough that lawlessness just will not be tolerated. So yes, you need police reform, you need training, you need to hold those individuals accountable for their behavior when it's wrong, but you also need leadership that says, on the other hand, a lot of the other behavior that's gone on has been inappropriate, criminal, and should be punished and should be prevented.
Thank you, Ken. Erik, please.
I pretty much agree with everything David and Ken said. I think defund the police is a horrible, horrible slogan. And in fact, we might need the opposite. If you want to have cops that are better trained, have higher quality, and are held to higher standards, we may actually need to pay cops more to attract the people we want, into the profession. It may cost more money to do a lot of the things that we want cops to do and to be able to do well. But at the same time, we do need to be serious about holding cops accountable. I think ending qualified immunity could be definitely part of that. I think, police unions are definitely a problem. My understanding is that a lot of that, came from kind of a bargain of where instead of demanding a lot of pay increases, they wanted to to make it harder to hold cops accountable. And I almost want to, kind of reverse that a little bit. So yeah, I think there's a lot that needs to be done with police reform. I think unfortunately the whole thing has become, the whole issue is distracted. I think when we find, I know I talk to a lot of people on the left and the right, there's a lot of overlap and a lot of consensus on what needs to be done on police reform. And now, because of a lot of the rhetoric on both sides, we're completely not even talking about that topic anymore. And it's become a whole, it's not even just about race, and now it's about violence and a lot of other things that are unnecessarily polarizing.
Thank you. Omega?
All right. I agree with the previous three speakers. Defunding the police is definitely not the answer. Let's not forget that the police department's responsibility is not limited to just policing, us. It's policing criminals. A lot of these people are armed to the teeth and are going to do the wrong thing no matter what. So, do we really want our men and women in blue, not to have the means and the ability to be able to do their jobs effectively, which most police officers do their job and do it well. The overwhelming majority. You do have, bad ones that are in the mix, just like you have bad doctors, bad lawyers, bad accountants, and so on and so forth. So to paint them all with a broad brush, like we've done, in the last few months, that they're all bad and they're hunting people down, it's not the case. You look at, for example, what's happened in Compton, California. I'm sure we probably have seen it or heard about it on the news. These two deputy sheriffs are sitting in their squad car and somebody just walks up and decides to open fire. That is completely unacceptable. There is no rationale that that can be presented to say that is warranted or justified. It's just not, and it's gotten out of control. All that defunding the police will do is make the most vulnerable people in our society more vulnerable, and more often than not, the most vulnerable people in our society, unfortunately, are typically the inner cities, urban communities, and people of color. So if you talk to people that are actually from these communities, right, their rhetoric is very different than what we see being propagated on the mainstream news. They're people that actually live in these places are not saying, hey, we don't want the police, we want to defund the police. So, there's a lot of conflicting, jargon going on about, should we do it? And it's a terrible slogan. Does there need to be police reform? Yes. Does there need to be more training? Yes. But to defund them, that's completely absurd, because the people that make laws and rule our country, they have police, they have private security. For the common person not to be able to pick up the phone and be able to call the police because a crime is being committed, that's absolutely nuts. That's crazy. So no, we definitely need to have police.
Thank you very much, Omega. I'm afraid we are running out of time. I'm going to ask one last question that I feel it's important to address, and then we shall wrap up. A lot of you touched upon it. David, Erik, I remember you touched upon this. There is an achievement gap in education between the Black community in the United States and other racial groups. Why do you think this is the case? And what would you propose to improve the educational achievement of the Black community? And what do you think, how do you think it affects the success of the Black community? David,
Okay.
Take it away.
I'm going to start. The educational achievement gap is a problem because of poverty. All right. When you look at all the international tests and the United States comes out 17th or 18th, when you subtract for poverty, we're in every single subject at least the third highest. 1, 2, 3, maybe 4. Subtract poverty and there's no education gap. So that's the first thing. Now, what I really want to address is a couple things that came up earlier, and I'm going to try to squeeze this all in. Regardless of where you are, the best schools have the best leaders and the best teachers who have the best resources to do their work creatively. There's been a movement to end that, to stop creativity and stop leadership at a local level. Now, that includes what gets taught. By the way, I taught economics, and I taught kids how to do checks. And those things are taught, but again, that's state by state, district by district, school by school. So if you want that, walk into your kid's school and demand it. Because if parents open their mouths and want it, it can happen, okay? The most serious thing, though, is not just a teacher shortage, a good teacher shortage. The numbers of potential good and great teachers has just dropped over the decades because the best potential teachers don't want to get paid as a teacher. They want to go into business or law or anything else where they can get 5, 6, 10 times that amount of money. So even if they are starting out as teachers in the city, they'll leave. Why? Because suburbs are going to pull them out. Because the suburbs with all the money are going to recruit them and they're going to go. That's why I left the city. I love the school I taught in. I love the kids I taught, but I had a family to raise. So I picked myself up and I moved my career to the suburbs. That's important. Erik talked about, like increasing the pay of police. You got to damn well increase the pay of teachers if you want to change the people who teach. And it's the only way you're going to increase our education gap, period.
Thank you, David. Ken, please.
Okay. I guess I'm going to, I can't dispute what Dave is saying, but I am concerned that there are many cases where it is not just dollars. I look at, for example, we lived for decades in New Jersey. And in New Jersey, there are a number of low-income school districts, heavy minority populations that are funded entirely by the state, that spend far more per pupil than do any of the suburban school districts. Their teachers are paid as much as the suburban school teachers, and yet, at least in those districts, if you look at Newark, for example, they are not hurting from a pay standpoint, and yet the educational outcomes are just not there. I think that there are lots of fingers that can be pointed in terms of contributing factors. I think that having the parent, again, 2-parent households, and having the parents engaged in their kids' education and concerned about it is huge. I have one of my kids who, when he got out of college, went very altruistic move to Teach for America, a program where he was assigned to a minority school in a rough area of Washington, D.C. He said the leadership of that school was such that they didn't want him there. He was forced upon them. They did anything they could do to discourage him and drive him out. So the leadership of education at the school level is critical, absolutely critical. I think that the ability of the parents, again, it comes to their upbringing and their ability to advocate for their children. There's just not enough effective advocacy for the kids demanding improvements in the quality of education, as well as even the quality of facilities. So, too much is, other populations would not stand for that. I think those are all, they all contribute to the educational gap, the outcome gap.
Thank you, Ken.
I would just close with one other thing, which is I actually left my career very early due to a heart attack and this, that, and the other thing. I wound up teaching for a few years, and I taught at New Jersey City University, which is in Jersey City. And I got to tell you, I saw the kids who came in there who were motivated, good kids, largely Latino immigrants, okay? And I saw the preparation, the education they came in with, and it was atrocious. And the fact that the schools would just graduate people that couldn't read or write, a coherent sentence or paragraph is just, it's unconscionable. So there's a lot of blame to be spread around.
Erik, please.
Yeah, unfortunately, I feel I'm a bit of a pessimist on this issue. And the reason I say that is Going to Ken's point, I've seen a lot of studies and data showing disappointing results, unfortunately, even when schools are more funded. I've also seen on the other side, disappointing results of school choice programs. Both of these things in the past, I really believed could improve educational outcomes. I don't have an answer on what we can do to improve it. I really wish I did. The one thing I always hear a lot of teachers say in struggling schools is that they deal a lot of it is disciplinary issues, that they're so distracted by disciplinary issues that it's hard to teach. I don't know what you do. I don't know if you take kids that are disciplinary problems and put them in a different type of school environment so that the other kids can learn, because that's certainly going to disrupt, the classroom environment. But I don't know. I'm sure that similar things have been tried. I don't have an answer, unfortunately, on how to close that gap. I do think a lot of it, we keep coming back to this, to culture and the value of education. I do agree with David that we should pay teachers more, only because we're expecting more of them, and we should, right? And we want to attract, the people that we can, which is what David was pointing out. But I also think sometimes, and this is something similar to cops, we ask too much sometimes of both cops and teachers to deal with these really deep social issues that you can't expect a teacher to fix every problem a child has, and you can't expect a cop to deal with all the problems that people are facing. And so I think so much of it is just that, unfortunately, I don't have an answer to, because I think a lot of it is cultural. I think a lot of it is economic, and trying to figure out what we can do to reduce economic inequality, I think, can go a long way to improving both crime and educational outcomes.
Thank you, Erik. Omega?
All right. I think that, to Erik's point, that this issue is definitely cultural, and to, something that Ken kind of begin to touch on. If you look at, other, people groups, other ethnic groups like the Jewish community, right? When the Jews first immigrated here, after the Second World War, they weren't thought very highly of by the people that were already here. Their community for a while was outcasted. If you look at when the Irish came here in the early 1900s, it was kind of the same thing. And what they did, and those two communities used as an example, is they band together to lift themselves out of their disenfranchised state. The Chinese did that when they came here. The Japanese did it as well, and so did the Koreans. So, when a Jewish person came here, they opened a business, and when another Jewish family came here, they helped that Jewish family open a business, and so on and so forth. And now you look at the Jewish community today, and they're thriving for the most part. You look at the Irish community today, they're thriving for the most part, and so on and so on. A lot of the issues that the Black community faces in terms of the achievement gap is, again, the family. You don't have moms and dads that are getting married and staying married. Ken made a good point that, getting married in today's culture is something that upper middle class people now do. It's become an inconvenience to get married. It's become an inconvenience to have children. And that has been, institutionalized by societal norms that, it's okay to have children out of wedlock. You don't have to have a baby if you get pregnant. You don't need to get married. You can do it on your own. Men are being attacked in our culture, which started long before right now. You look at feminism and how it's, attacked, men. There's lots of different things that you can point to that kind of create, the issues that we have today, particularly to the Black community, on why the Black community is so far behind in almost every possible measurable metric. And to me, it all centers around the family unit and the lack thereof of consistent values being taught both morally and secularly to children.
Thank you very much. I am afraid we have run out of time. I actually run a bit beyond the time I promised to finish. I just want to give you all one last minute each to summarize your impressions and your thoughts about this issue and about this roundtable. And if you want to, you can let people know how they can keep in touch with you, how they can connect with you. And David, take it away. 1 minute.
Sure. Well, it's nice to know we touched on problems that are almost impossible to solve, but we did our best. And again, I'm kind of looking at from the ground level kind of solutions, whether they be in education or as cops or anybody else, or as families or as kids or neighborhoods. If there's not a grassroots ownership of improvement, it really never happens top down. And I know because of my specific situation in education, top down never worked. And it always has to start from the bottom. Parents, kids, teachers, cops, everybody has to work together to try to figure out how to solve these problems. And I think I've spoken earlier about what I think would work, but it's usually not from the top down. As far as getting in touch with me, I'm on Facebook, I'm on Twitter. I have a blog that I can't remember what its name is, but I can email it to somebody if they want it. I haven't written in it in a couple of weeks. I did write a COVID story, but that's a whole other story by itself. But I want to thank you for this opportunity, Tomer, and I think this is a fabulous discussion, and I hope we do more of these.
Thank you very much. We will post in the description below the blog of David Greene after he finds his own URL. Ken, take it away, please.
I'll chat
Okay.
it. I'll chat it to you.
Okay. Omega several times said something I think is really key, which really reflects my own philosophy as well, which is the importance of self-accountability. I think too often our society right now, is willing to let people off the hook and put the blame on somebody else. So I'm a strong believer in self-accountability, personal accountability on the one hand, but also I believe that we have a society that is wealthy enough in total to help those who cannot help themselves. I think that we need to put those two things together. I think that people who have the means, both financially, but also just from the standpoint of knowledge, energy, etc., can help the situation. Whether it's taking, exercising a strong voice and encouraging certain behavior and values, whether it's mentoring people, whether it's taking stands to make sure there's quality education. I think all of that is required to continue the progress, but really that's been made since the Jim Crow era, but to really leap across the chasm. But that leap is going to be a marathon. It's not a sprint.
Thank you, Ken. Erik.
One thing I didn't get a chance to talk about as much as I wanted to is just, again, my experience growing up in a poor, lower income, working class white community where we all went to the same schools. We had the same teachers. Wasn't any, they're white, racism was not a factor. The schools wasn't a factor. You saw huge disparities in that community of a lot of people suffering from the same things that a lot of the Black community suffers from in terms of drug addiction, in terms of crime rates, in terms of teen pregnancies, in terms of not graduating from high school. And the point I'm trying to make by pointing that out is I really think it's a much bigger issue than just race. Some of it might be economic and some of it might be cultural. And I think we need to hit, all of those different fronts.
Thank you, Erik. Omega.
I would conclude with, again, going back to something that I said earlier is personal accountability. To David and Ken's point, my former life, what I did was, I was in executive management and, very little changed from the top down. Before I was in executive management, the way that things did change is when, people at the ground level decided that, hey, there needed to be a change, and through the appropriate channels, things actually took place. And that's what we need here, really as a culture and as a society, is that society must band together and say, hey, we are united together as one. We're 350 million strong, and we need to stand together united as one. We can't afford to allow our society be blurred by, the pigmentation of people's skin. That's not to say that people don't have certain cultures and different backgrounds. We need to ignore that, but to look at people and frame people in terms of black, white, Asian, and what else, it does everyone a disservice in a much larger scope. But going back to African Americans and blacks, people of color, they got to take personal accountability. You got to be able to look in the mirror and say, hey, what can we do that requires no one else to do anything for us, and change that? And just like someone who is, trying to recover from an addiction or trying to improve their life, you have to first realize that, hey, there's something wrong here, and I need to do something about it before anybody can help you. Otherwise, you can't reform. No change can be brought forth. You have to make a decision that there's something wrong and something needs to change.
Guys, I'm afraid we have come to our roundtable's end. I'll summarize by saying that it has been a great pleasure having you on. I feel that we touched a lot about a lot of the nuance in this complex issue. These kind of conversations give me great hope about possibly resolving these complex issues. And I think it's important to always address it like there wasn't any us versus them narrative here. I would challenge the viewers to guess which of the speakers is left-leaning and which is right-leaning. I feel that usually 20% of the issue causes 80% of the conflict. And when we focus on the actual issue at hand, what are people's values, what are their concerns, what are their opinions, rather than on castigating or demonizing the other side, then we can actually make great progress. We've talked about all kinds of cultural icons in the Black community, ranging all the way from Cardi B to Colin Powell. Y'all gotta stop hating, man. And different issues that are plaguing the community, such as education, the collapse of the Black nuclear family, a culture of criminality, and lack of positive role models in the community. There's a lot of complex issues here. We also touched about racism, how that affects the heritage of racism. And I think that the more we continue to spread the art of listening and actually see this as a joint challenge for all of us as a nation, as an American nation, as fellow humans, the more we can actually achieve real solutions and real progress. And I hope for the best. Thank you very much, everybody, for listening. Thank you, everybody, for participating. I hope to see you guys in the future, and y'all have a wonderful, beautiful day.